They trained her to survive pain in silence and obedience in fear, until one man dragged her out of the place that broke her and stood between her and the ones who still hunt her. Now they're coming back. The room had no windows, not because they were unnecessary, but because they were forbidden. Light came from long strips of white built into the ceiling, cold and unblinking, designed to remove any sense of time or weather or warmth. The walls were a flat metallic gray, polished enough to reflect movement, but not enough to provide any real identity. The air held no scent beyond sterile chemicals and recycled oxygen, filtered so heavily that even the faintest trace of human presence felt erased. Cleo sat upright on the narrow metal table, her legs hanging straight down, bare toes barely brushing the cold surface as she kept her spine rigid and her hands folded loosely in her lap, the practiced stillness of someone who had learned long ago that movement drew attention. Beyond the glass wall, muted shapes moved. She could not hear them clearly, but she had learned to read the rhythm of their gestures, the clipped motions of their hands, the way their heads tilted when they were assessing, irritated or satisfied, because silence had trained her to recognize evaluation without sound. The metal arm descended from the ceiling, moving with slow precision, stopping just in front of her collarbone. The tip glowed faintly red, not hot yet, only waiting. Cleo's eyes stayed forward. She did not blink. She did not tense. She did not shift her weight or clench her jaw or swallow too hard. Because they were watching. They were always watching. The metal tip began to heat. The first few seconds weren't painful. Just warmth. Then pressure. Then a slow, unmistakable burn as the skin began to react. Her body registered the sensation long before her mind was permitted to acknowledge it, nerves firing warnings through pathways that had long ago learned to stay quiet. Her fingers twitched once. Behind the glass, one of the observers stilled, his posture sharpening as though noting the smallest failure. The heat intensified. Still, she did not make a sound. They waited for her to beg. They waited for her to cry. But she had been trained past that stage. When the metal finally lifted away, the skin beneath it was pale and blistered, but untouched by panic, untouched by fear, untouched by anything that might make her interesting to them as a person. A door slid open on the far wall with a hiss. An assistant entered without looking at her face. "Back to holding," he said quietly to the console strapped around his wrist. He didn't touch her. He never touched the subjects unless they failed. She stepped down from the table at the signal light and walked barefoot down the hallway, the cold metal floor familiar beneath her soles, the white corridors stretching endlessly in both directions, every footstep swallowed by sound-dampening materials embedded in the walls. She passed other doors. Some were silent, some were not, soft crying behind one, angry shouting behind another, a dull, rhythmic thud behind a third. She didn't slow. She wasn't allowed to. Her door sealed behind her with a soft, pneumatic click. The cell was just large enough for a narrow bed bolted to the wall, a sink that only produced cold water, and a surveillance lens embedded high in the corner, eye-shaped and unblinking. She sat on the edge of the bed, not because she was tired, because it was the correct behavior after evaluation. Later, when the lights shifted, not to darkness, because darkness wasn't provided, only to a slightly dimmer artificial state that simulated something like night, she lay flat on the bed, hands folded over her abdomen, staring at the ceiling. This was the part they didn't observe, the quiet space, the nothing, where thoughts were not rewarded, where memories surfaced only when she was too tired to keep them buried. Sometimes she remembered small hands, sometimes a voice that didn't speak in commands, sometimes warmth. She had stopped trying to understand what those fragments were supposed to be. The alarm didn't start loudly. It began as a subtle tremor in the lighting system, a faint flicker, barely perceptible, the kind of detail that only someone who spent years studying ceilings would ever notice. Then the ventilation system stuttered. Then the hum of the facility changed pitch. Her eyes shifted slightly toward the surveillance lens. Behind the walls, somewhere far away, muffled thudding noises began to echo through the metal framework of the building. Not screaming, not chaos, purposeful, heavy, controlled, footsteps that were not running. Footsteps that were not wandering. Footsteps that were looking for something. The lights flickered again, this time harder. Her door remained sealed. No one came. No one checked on her. She sat up slowly, fingers curling against the thin bedding. The hallway sound grew closer. She felt it through the walls before she heard it clearly. Vibrations traveling through steel and concrete that suggested force, something deliberate, something breaking through layers that were designed not to be breached. A sharp crack echoed, then another. She stepped off the bed and walked to the door, placing her palm flat against the cold metal. Not because she believed she could open it, because something inside her recognized the sound. And for the first time in a very long time, her heartbeat changed, not faster, not frantic, but different, like a warning she had not been trained to turn off. The lights went out. Total dark. Her reflection disappeared from the walls. Her world narrowed to breathing. Footsteps stopped directly outside her cell. Silence. Then the locking mechanism began to disengage, bolts sliding back, hydraulics releasing, the sound of metal surrendering. Her fingers instinctively tightened against the door. The door began to open. A sliver of darkness appeared, and on the other side of it, someone was finally coming toward her. The darkness didn't feel like fear. It felt like silence becoming heavier. The door stood partially open, the narrow gap exposing a strip of hallway lit only by emergency crimson lighting that turned the white metal walls into tunnels of pulsing shadow. Cleo remained still, not because she was unsure, but because she had been conditioned to wait for instruction, for permission, for the moment when movement was no longer considered defiance. The air on the other side of the door felt different, not recycled, not stagnant, charged. Something moved beyond her line of sight with controlled weight, the faint vibration of footsteps not erratic or rushed but deliberate, like something that had already decided where it was going and what it intended to take. Her fingers tightened slightly against the door's edge. The hallway shifted with sound that wasn't manufactured. Breathing, fabric, the faint whisper of leather. A shadow crossed the narrow line of light, and then a man stepped into view. He did not wear a lab coat. He did not carry a clipboard. He did not look at the walls. He looked only at her. Dark blonde hair, cut close and practical, shadowed by the dim emergency lighting. His eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were not frantic, not uncertain, not cruel, blue, cold, focused. The kind of eyes that had already calculated distance, exits, threat levels, and survival paths long before she ever saw his face. He took in the room in a single slow breath. The table, the restraints, the burn mark on her skin. And then he stepped fully into the doorway. A muted shout echoed down the hall. Metal struck metal somewhere far away. The man didn't turn his head. He studied her for one controlled breath, reading the tension in her shoulders, the way her weight was balanced, how close she stood to the edge of the doorway. "Stay with me." Her body reacted before her mind had time to question it, shifting instinctively toward him, posture adjusting as though his presence had redefined where safety existed. Walk. He stepped aside just enough to give her a path. She moved. Not fast, not slow, calibrated. Like she had been trained to move in hallways that belonged to men who didn't care whether she lived or not. He fell in behind her without explanation, without touch, without unnecessary sound. The hallway smelled like ozone and metal, the red lights making everything feel narrower, tighter, as if the entire building were compressing around them. Doors stood open where they had never been allowed to open before. Glass shattered in some places, walls cracked, consoles sparking like dying nerves. A man in uniform rounded the corner ahead of them. His eyes widened. He lifted his weapon. He never fired. The movement was too fast. The dark blonde man closed the distance before the sound could happen, striking cleanly and efficiently, the guard dropping in silent collapse to the floor. He didn't look back, didn't slow. He placed a hand lightly at the center of Cleo's back. Not forceful, not soft, directional. "Stay behind me." She moved closer. The proximity felt wrong and right at the same time, her shoulder nearly brushing the edge of his arm, her breathing sinking to the rhythm of his without conscious decision. They moved through the facility with rhythm instead of panic, stepping over debris and fallen equipment, passing cracked glass walls that once separated observers from subjects, observation rooms now dark and useless. He knew where he was going. He had known before he entered. The path turned toward a reinforced exit corridor. A heavy metal blast door stood at the end of it, locked, power blinking on a damaged panel beside it. He stepped forward, braced one hand against the wall, raised his other. A controlled strike landed against a weakened section of exposed mechanism, metal bending with a violent screech that echoed down the corridor. He struck it again, and again, until the lock sparked, then died. The blast door rolled upward with a groaning mechanical protest. Cold air rushed in, real air, night air, sharp and clean and unfamiliar. Cleo froze, not because of fear, because her body had never known what stood beyond that door. The man turned to face her fully now. He did not smile. He did not offer reassurance. He stepped close, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the sterile chill of her skin. "You're not property," he said. His voice was low, steady. "Real. And you're not staying." Something cracked behind her ribs. She didn't cry, didn't shake, but the world widened. They moved through the doorway. The metal slammed shut behind them. Night swallowed the corridor. Wind carried scents she could not name. Dirt, trees, open air. She took one slow step forward, then another. The sky existed above her, vast, endless, uncaged. Stars scattered like fractures in the dark. She did not look at him. She didn't know how. She only knew that she could feel his presence beside her, close, anchored, immovable. He led her through shadowed terrain, away from the structure, away from the concrete and steel and buried suffering, his hand occasionally brushing her arm when direction changed, guiding without gripping. After several minutes, they reached a waiting vehicle concealed beneath heavy branches and camouflage netting. He opened the rear door. "Get in." She did. She did. The interior smelled of fabric and metal and machine oil and something human beneath it all. He slid into the seat beside her. The door shut. The engine started. The wheels turned. The building disappeared behind them. She sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes forward, absorbing the vibration of movement, the sound of tires against soil, the unfamiliar sensation of leaving something she had never believed she would escape. She didn't speak. He didn't ask her to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It felt like protection. It felt like control. It felt like the presence of someone who would not let her be taken again. And somewhere beneath her stillness, beneath her training, beneath the years of silence and compliance, her mind registered something new. Not fear, not pain, possibility. The vehicle moved through the night at a steady, controlled pace, its tires pressing into uneven dirt roads that stretched far beyond anything she had ever been allowed to witness, the vibration of the engine settling into her bones in a way that felt unfamiliar but not frightening, simply real. She sat upright in the back seat, hands folded neatly in her lap out of habit rather than need, her shoulders tense from awareness instead of fear, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window as the world widened outside of her control. The silence inside the vehicle was not empty. It was deliberate. The man who had pulled her from the facility drove without speaking, his hands steady on the wheel, posture controlled, attention layered, as if the road itself was merely another calculated obstacle. She did not know his name yet. He had not offered it, and she had not asked, because questions were not part of survival. His presence was enough. Solid, unyielding, quietly dangerous in the way men were when danger was something they had already met and beaten. The darkness outside was not artificial like the darkness she knew. It moved differently. It breathed. It carried faint traces of wind and damp earth and unfamiliar distance. For the first time, the night did not feel like absence. After a long stretch of unbroken motion, the vehicle slowed. Gravel shifted beneath the tires. Branches brushed along the exterior. The headlights swept across a cabin that stood among trees like it had grown there, its weathered wood darker than shadow, its shape simple and unrestrained. The engine stopped. The silence was different from before, alive. He stepped out first, then moved around and opened the door beside her. "Come," he said. Not unkind, not soft, certain. She stepped out. Her bare feet met gravel, sharp and uneven, biting lightly into skin that had known only metal and tile, and though the sensation registered, she made no sound. She refused to. She was not permitted reactions. The night air touched her skin, cool and alive, carrying scents she had no word for, only the awareness that the world was wider and deeper than the walls she had lived inside. They walked toward the cabin without speaking. The wood of the porch creaked beneath their steps. The door unlocked. He stepped back and let her enter first. Inside, the air was warm. Not manufactured warmth, real warmth. Wood smoke lingered faintly, mixed with aged leather and the honest scent of someone who lived here out of choice rather than order. He closed the door behind them. The sound of the lock was not a cage. It was a boundary. "You'll stay here," he said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a command. It was structure. She nodded. He set a bottle of water and a plate of food on the table without instruction. He didn't watch. He didn't hover. He stepped back instead, leaning one shoulder against the wall, arms folding loosely, his attention divided between her and the space as though he measured danger as instinctively as breathing. Minutes passed. She didn't touch the food, not because she wasn't hungry, because she had never been taught that she was allowed to eat without being told. Hunger grew. Her body shifted, her hand lifted. She took a small bite. The taste was overwhelming, real, heavy, honest. Her throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with swallowing. He noticed. He looked away. She sat on the couch, not rigid, not soft, balanced. Silence settled around them. Then, without meaning to, she spoke. "Why?" The word felt strange in her mouth. He answered without delay. "They shouldn't have had you. No more, no less." Later, the wind pressed faintly against the cabin walls, softer than alarms, quieter than alarms, and something in her chest tightened before she could control it. Her hand clenched in the blanket she had pulled around her shoulders. He spoke then. "You don't have to stay faceless here." The words weren't forced, they weren't soft. They were truth. Her fingers tightened. Her breath shifted. "Cleo." The name felt like exposure, like stepping into light. He nodded once, not surprised, not emotional, just accepting. "Cleo," he repeated. Only once, as if to acknowledge the gift of it. He moved toward the small back room and lifted a folded blanket, holding it out without stepping too close, without pressing it into her hands. She took it. Her fingers brushed his briefly. It was enough to flood her body with awareness. He stepped back. "You sleep," he said. "Where will you be?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He met her gaze fully for the first time. "My name is Eric," he said calmly, "and I'll be right here." The name settled in her. Simple. Solid. Real. She lay down on the couch with the blanket drawn around her shoulders. The cushion was softer than anything she had known, but it did not trap her. The light in the room remained low instead of disappearing, warm instead of endless. Her eyes drifted toward the wooden ceiling. Wind moved through the trees outside. The cabin expanded gently around her breathing. She heard Eric move quietly through the space behind her, not pacing, not watching, just staying close enough to matter. Her breathing slowed. Sleep came slowly. But it came. And for the first time, it wasn't broken by alarms, restraints, or sterile light. It was guarded by a man who had said his name. Morning came without announcement. There was no artificial brightness flooding the room, no mechanical shift of lighting designed to pull her out of sleep, only the quiet softening of darkness as pale gray light slipped through the thin curtains and laid slow patterns across the worn wooden floor. Cleo woke slowly, not in panic, not in fear. She woke because her body, for the first time, was not being dragged from sleep. The blanket rested loosely across her shoulders, heavy and real, and she noticed immediately that her hands were open, not clenched, that her jaw did not ache from being locked tight, that her muscles were not braced as if pain were waiting just beyond her awareness. The cabin was quiet, not empty. She felt him before she heard him. Eric moved somewhere beyond the main room, the quiet sound of ceramic touching wood, the faint scrape of metal against a mug, the steady rhythm of a man who did not need silence to feel in control. She sat up. The floor did not punish her when she stood. The wood felt alive beneath her bare feet, warmer than metal, textured in a way that made her pause, just to feel it instead of fearing it. When she stepped into the main room, he stood at the small table, sleeves pushed up slightly, dark blonde hair loosened from sleep, blue eyes lifting only briefly to acknowledge that she was there. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. He nodded once. "You're awake." A simple fact. She moved toward the table and sat where she chose to sit, not where she was told, not where a camera would prefer. She placed herself where it felt balanced, where the room felt like something she was inside instead of something she was kept within. A cup appeared in front of her, warm. She wrapped her hands around it before she thought about whether she was allowed. Heat spread through her fingers. "You don't have to erase yourself in this house," Eric said quietly, not turning fully toward her, as if the words were not meant to pressure, but to establish a rule that could not be taken back. She didn't answer. Silence still belonged to her. He leaned against the counter, arms loose across his chest, not blocking exits, not watching for mistakes, simply existing like a boundary that did not hurt. She drank slowly. "You'll stay," he said after a while. Not a command, not comfort, structure. "You'll eat when your body asks." A small pause. "You'll sleep when you're tired." Another beat. "And you won't apologize for existing." Her eyes lifted to him, not because she meant to, because something in those words forced recognition. He met her gaze, and there was something territorial in the way he held it. Not ownership, not control for cruelty, but a line drawn in quiet certainty that whatever stood inside these walls was not to be diminished. She understood. This was his space, but it had not been built to cage. Silence stretched. Her fingers tightened slightly around the warm cup. "What happened to them?" she asked. Her voice was not broken, not shaking. Factual. Necessary. Eric didn't answer right away. That pause mattered. "My team hit 3 levels," he said evenly. "We pulled as many as we could reach before the alarms went full lockdown." He didn't soften the truth, didn't decorate it. They didn't all make it out. Her fingers went still. She didn't cry. But something behind her eyes shifted. Not grief, not collapse. Recognition. "They were trained to be quiet," she said. "Yes," he answered. "They made it harder to save themselves," she added. "Yes," he said again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. She swallowed slowly. "They didn't deserve that." "No," he said. "No comfort, no pity, only agreement." Her hands lowered slightly around the cup, but the warmth didn't feel the same. The weight did. She carried them, not as ghosts, not as wounds, as truth. He watched her, not to remove the weight, not to fix it, but to let her hold it without breaking. That was respect. Later she sat on the couch again, but this time she allowed herself to lean back fully instead of balancing on the edge, the blanket drawn loosely around her shoulders like something she had chosen, not something she used to hide. Eric remained nearby, sometimes standing beside the stove, sometimes sitting in the heavy wooden chair, never hovering, just present. When the wind rose suddenly and pressed harder against the cabin walls, a sharp sound ran along the wood like fingers, and something old and fast twisted tight in her chest before she could stop it. She flinched. He noticed instantly. He crossed the space and lowered himself in front of her instead of towering over her, his presence steady, his movements deliberate, his voice controlled. "You're here," Eric said quietly. "Not comfort. Truth. They don't exist in this room." Her fingers tightened without her noticing. Her breath shifted. He didn't touch her. He stayed close long enough for her body to believe him. Then he moved back, not retreating, not disappearing, simply giving space without removing the certainty of his presence. That night, she closed the distance between them without being told. She did not sit beside him. She did not reach. She simply moved closer until the space felt balanced instead of vast. He didn't react, didn't comment, didn't pull away. That was his choice. Before she went toward the small back room to sleep, she paused in the doorway. "You're not sending me back." It was not a question. It was fear trying to look like strength. "Never," Eric said. One word, but it carried the weight of everything he had already broken to reach her. She nodded. She lay down. And when sleep took her, her body remained open instead of curled, her shoulders no longer braced for hands that did not deserve her, her breath slow and natural. Outside, the night remained quiet. Inside, something steadier than fear began to exist. Not trust, not yet, but the bones of it. The silence in the cabin shifted after that morning. It wasn't louder, and it wasn't heavier, but it changed texture, the way air changes before a storm that hasn't yet shown itself. Cleo began to notice things she had been trained to stop noticing. The way the floor warmed slightly where sunlight touched it, the way the kettle sang softly when water began to heat, the way the trees outside moved without instruction or purpose, simply because the wind allowed them to. She started sleeping longer. Not because she was tired in the way exhaustion had once ruled her body, but because her mind no longer felt like it needed to stay alert every moment she closed her eyes. There were nights when dreams pressed close, hovering at the edges of her consciousness without fully crossing through. But even those felt less sharp now, less violent, as though something inside her had learned that she was no longer trapped. Eric noticed. He never commented on it, but he adjusted to it. He kept the lamp lower in the evenings, not to simulate night, but to make the space feel smaller and safer when darkness pressed in from the trees. He stayed closer without crowding. He positioned himself in ways that shifted invisible lines between the outside world and the inside of the cabin. Protection without spectacle. One afternoon, she sat alone at the table when a sound echoed from beyond the trees, a sharp cracking noise, like wood splitting under pressure, and the familiar instinct rose inside her chest before she could reason with it. Her back straightened, shoulders stiffening, breath caught halfway through her lungs, because fear had always been structured and loud in her old life. This fear was quiet, personal. Her fingers curled against the wood grain. Eric entered the room that moment, and he didn't ask what had startled her, didn't crowd her space or demand words, only crossed the room with measured steps and placed himself where she could see him, where she could feel his presence settle the air. "It's just the trees," he said, not comforting, not dismissive, real. She nodded, but the tension did not leave her body immediately, because fear had not lived in logic, only in muscle and memory, and her hands remained tight even after the sound faded back into silence. That night, the dreams changed. They were not full scenes. Not relived pain. They were fragments. Flashes of white rooms and the sound of metal cooling too fast. The faint hum of ceiling lights. The shadow of the glass wall where observers stood without faces. She did not wake screaming. She woke feeling like she had run without moving, her breath uneven, her hands cold. Eric was already awake. He always was. He sat in the chair near the stove, barely moving, but instantly aware the moment her breathing changed. "You're safe," he said, not softly, not loudly, with the same certainty he used when breaking locks. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket closer, not because she was cold, but because she was learning that it was allowed. "I don't remember their faces," she said quietly. "That's normal," he said. He didn't ask who. He knew. "They trained it out of you." She nodded. Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty, because now it carried truth instead of avoidance. And for the first time, she did not need to pretend that the truth was smaller than it actually was. Over the next days, she noticed that her body began reacting to things that had once passed through her without response, such as the warmth of sunlight resting against her hands, or the rough softness of wool when she wrapped the blanket tighter, or the taste of food becoming more than substance and turning into something closer to preference. She discovered she liked simple things: the sound of wind moving through tall grass, the scent of rain before it came, the way the fire shifted from orange to blue when the wood burned lower. These were not lessons. They were discoveries. One evening, she found herself standing in the doorway, watching Eric reload a small weapon, the movement controlled and familiar in his hands, and she realized she was not afraid of that. She was comforted by it, because it was not a threat to her, but a promise to whatever dared try again. "You don't look at me like I'm fragile," she said. The words surprised her. He glanced at her. "I don't think you are." It wasn't flattery. It wasn't tenderness. It was assessment. The kind he trusted. She looked away, but not in shame. In thought. Another night passed, and with it, another dream, sharper than the last, more vivid, carrying the sound of a heartbeat that hadn't been hers, the awareness of hands guiding instead of harming. And when she woke this time, she did not pull inward. She spoke. "They made me hold still," she said. He said nothing. He shifted closer, but not close enough to steal the space, only enough to make the air feel less wide around her. "They told me that pain was weakness," she continued, voice steady now. "They were wrong," he said. She exhaled slowly. The breath felt like something new. Days turned quieter, but quieter did not mean empty. The quiet filled with weight she had never known how to carry, and with the growing awareness that feeling something did not mean collapsing beneath it, it meant noticing that she was alive. One afternoon, as the light filtered in low and gold through the windows, she sat on the floor instead of the couch, back resting lightly against the wood, watching dust move through the air like tiny floating stars, and she felt something unfamiliar rise slowly in her chest. It was not fear. It was not pain. It was not confusion. It was tension, not the dangerous kind. The kind that came from wanting to understand herself rather than survive herself. When Eric moved past her, she did not flinch. She did not brace. She let herself stay. He noticed. He didn't comment. That night, she stood in the doorway and looked out into the darkness beyond the cabin, seeing the outline of the trees against the sky, the way the stars hung without permission, and for the first time, the outside world no longer looked like something waiting to hurt her. It looked like something that had been waiting for her, and without thinking, without rehearsing, without calculating the cost of exposure, she spoke into the quiet room behind her. "I'm scared," she said. Not of him. Not of the cabin. Not of the dark. Of herself. Eric's voice came from behind her, low and real. "Good." The word wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was honest. "Means you're not numb anymore." That truth settled into her bones like fire that didn't burn. The first warning did not come as a sound, but as a pressure change in the air, as though the cabin had tightened around itself in quiet alarm, and the forest beyond the walls had drawn so still that the night felt staged rather than natural. The kind of silence that stretched across the trees did not belong to animals or wind, but to something deliberate and approaching. Cleo felt it before she could explain it, because her body had been trained to recognize patterns of danger long ago, and that same training now pulled her muscles tight while her mind tried to remain calm. What had once helped her survive began rising inside her again, but this time it no longer felt like safety. It felt like warning. Eric sensed the change at the same moment. He did not speak, and he did not rush, but rose from his chair with quiet control and crossed the room in measured steps, his attention shifting toward the window as his posture sharpened in a way that spoke of focus rather than panic. His presence changed the room without disturbing the air, and Cleo trusted that change more than she trusted the silence. The woods felt wrong. She watched the reflection of his movement in the glass rather than looking past him, because watching him felt more real than scanning a forest that had learned how to lie. He turned back toward her after a long breath. "Sit," he said in a low, even tone that felt less like a command and more like a structure he was handing her to stand on. She moved to the chair and sat, not because she felt small, but because when the world began to feel unstable, the instructions he gave her felt like solid ground. He stepped closer and lifted his hand toward her neck with careful restraint, slowing his movements as if approaching something fragile, letting his fingers hover without contact as he found the faint ridge under her skin that she had spent years forcing herself to forget. "The implant," he said quietly. She swallowed and answered, because pretending had never helped her when truth arrived. "Yes." He had known before asking. He moved toward the cabinet and removed a compact device, its screen lighting his face in dim blue tones that flickered with symbols she did not recognize but instinctively understood were not good. "They traced it," he said calmly, with the kind of certainty that left no space for doubt. Her chest tightened slowly, not from sudden fear, but from the familiar return of lessons that had been carved too deep into her nervous system to disappear completely. The physical reaction felt old and dangerous, like a shadow reaching forward from a past she had not yet buried. "They'll come," she said, because part of her had always understood this would be the ending. "They're already close," he replied. The cabin no longer felt hidden after that. It felt thin, as though the walls were no longer blending into the forest, but standing in clear outline against whatever was moving through the dark. Cleo felt her body straighten without permission, her breath shortening as the old instinct to become smaller, quieter, and more valuable began taking shape inside her again. Her hands tightened in the blanket, feeling the familiar pull toward stillness. She recognized it happening. The regression felt like gravity. The obedience felt like instinct. Eric saw it before she could stop it. He crossed the space between them and lowered himself to her eye level, shifting her attention away from the corners of the room and back toward him, because he understood how fear widened when left alone. "You are not going back," he said, his voice steady enough to feel permanent. Words did not come easily when memory tightened around her throat. Outside, controlled movement traveled through the trees, sounds too measured and deliberate to belong to animals or accident. The disturbance moved with purpose, and the way the forest responded made it feel closer with every breath. Eric rose and moved to the concealed compartment in the wall, retrieving the weapon that caught the soft glow of the cabin light. He handled it with precision and familiarity, checking it once without breaking the calm that he had carried since the silence fell. "If they make it through the trees," he said, returning closer to her, "you move when I move, and you stay where I can shield you." Her fingers shifted against the blanket because her body wanted to obey and freeze at the same time, pulled in opposite directions by safety and memory. The conditioning crept higher in her nervous system. The pull toward quiet rose in her chest. The hope of invisibility pressed against her ribs. "I will slow you down," she said, in the flat tone that had once kept her alive. Eric stepped into her space immediately, close enough that she had no choice but to focus on him. "You are not the one who decides that," he said evenly, with a certainty that did not ask permission. "You do not evaluate your worth based on how fast you can disappear." Her breath faltered, not from fear, but from the collision of two truths her body had never been allowed to hold at the same time. Outside, footsteps became clearer against the earth, the sound traveling into the cabin through the floor and wooden walls as pressure and vibration rather than noise. She stood without fully meaning to, responding to the structure of the moment, responding to the presence of the man in front of her, while her body struggled to choose between learned helplessness and unfamiliar safety. "They will take me back," she said in a voice that felt old. Eric moved to the door and secured the lock with disciplined, efficient motion, then turned to face her again without wasting time. "They will try," he replied. She shook her head slowly, and the words that followed cut through her. "I belong to them." The way the sentence sat in the air felt poisonous. Eric turned fully toward her, and something deeper than anger passed through his eyes, a quiet and dangerous certainty that came from a place no one could reach. "You do not belong to anyone who breaks you," he said. The sound of boots pressing through dirt and leaves reached the cabin with more weight now, close enough to feel as vibration rather than imagination. The pacing outside carried the tight discipline of trained men who did not waste steps. Her vision narrowed as her body tried to retreat inward, searching for the numb place that had once kept her alive. Eric stepped into her line of sight again, closing the space with calm intention. "You are not disappearing," he said. Her voice would not rise. Something metallic brushed against the wood outside, followed by a faint scrape that tested the structure of the cabin in a way that felt meaningful rather than accidental. Her gaze drifted downward, drawn toward stillness, toward surrender, toward the quiet interior place where she had once learned to exist without feeling. Then she felt him closer. She could feel the heat of his presence, even without being touched. "You are not their subject," Eric said. Her heart hit harder. "You are not what they made." Her hands trembled slightly. "You are allowed to be here." Her eyes lifted to his. Something inside her shifted, not breaking, but opening, as though the tightest part of her chest had finally allowed air to move through. Outside, the proximity of danger grew stronger, the pressure against the walls more deliberate, the silence heavier. Inside her, something else rose. Anger moved through her like heat, not for what might happen, but for what had already been done. She drew in a breath that shook as it entered her lungs, and for the first time since the forest had gone too still, she realized her posture had changed. She wasn't shrinking anymore. She was standing. The woods did not erupt into chaos when the men returned, but tightened around the cabin in a silence so deliberate it felt engineered, as though every tree had been trained to hold its breath. Cleo stood at the center of the room, her spine straight and her hands loose, not because she felt ready, but because she no longer wanted to vanish when fear rose inside her. The old pull toward invisibility tried to surface, but Eric's presence anchored her in a way rules never had. Eric checked the door without dramatics, his movements controlled, because panic belonged to men who had already lost something, and he had no intention of losing her. Metal brushed the outer wall again, closer now, and the vibration slipped through the floor. "They're marking the perimeter," he said calmly, giving her information instead of silence. He stepped where she could see him. "They made you disappear," he said. "I'm not going to." He held her gaze. "Choose." The word did not offer comfort. It offered direction. Outside, something struck the cabin more forcefully, testing wood and resolve. Her instincts screamed to surrender, to be quiet, to survive by yielding. But the man in front of her did not look like a cage. He looked like a wall built to defend. "You can let them take you," he said evenly. "They'll own you again." Then he said, "Or you can stay." Her chest tightened. The war inside her was no longer silent. "I don't know how to fight," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. "That's not your role." He shifted slightly, protective without crowding. "Your role is to choose." The boots outside grew closer. The doorframe clicked softly as someone tested the lock. She lifted her chin. She met his eyes. "I choose you," she said. The words were quiet, but they were real. When the first lock shifted, she did not move toward it. She stepped toward him. "Behind me," he said. She moved, not because she was commanded, but because she wanted to stand. The air inside the cabin tightened when the first lock disengaged, stretching like a wire pulled too far, and Cleo understood that this was the moment everything she carried inside her would either own her forever or finally be severed. Eric moved fully in front of her, grounded and steady, not trapping her, but shielding her. Metal dragged along the cabin's side as the men tested the walls. Her hand drifted to her neck. Eric saw it. "They're not tracking your steps," he said. "They're tracking that." She nodded without fear. "They'll never stop," she said. "Not if you end it," he replied. The words did not feel like pressure. They felt like permission. She stepped away from him. He didn't stop her. She moved to the table and picked up the small knife, not as a weapon, but as a tool of choice. "You don't have to," he said. "If I don't," she answered, "they'll always own me." She lifted her hair. She exposed the place that had never belonged to her. When she drew the blade across her skin, the pain was sharp, controlled, different from what had been done to her before. It was hers. She worked the device free with shaking hands that refused to stop. For a moment it resisted, as though it still believed it had authority over her. It didn't. It came free. She dropped it. A dull sound. A dead thing. Outside the movement faltered, the confusion slow but real. She pressed a cloth to her neck and met Eric's eyes. Not seeking protection, seeking to be seen. He nodded. That was enough. The cabin felt different. She was no longer being hunted. She had broken the leash. "Behind me," Eric said. She moved there by choice. The door shook, the air changed, and for the first time she felt free. The cabin tightened when the door finally broke open, not with panic, but with purpose, as cold air poured in, carrying men who had trained themselves to move without noise and without mercy. Eric stepped forward immediately, blocking the path to Cleo with a calm that never faltered. One of the men saw the blood at her neck and moved fast. Eric moved faster. He redirected force. He destroyed angles. He kept the center of the room, turning their precision against them without spectacle. The fight stayed tight, controlled, efficient. Cleo watched because she no longer wanted to disappear. The shift came when one of the men lifted his wrist and listened. A decision passed through them. They withdrew, but not in defeat. One of them marked the cabin. They disappeared. Eric turned to her. "You're safe for the moment," he said. He reached for the keys and stopped. He let them fall. "They'll track the truck," he said. "We leave it." She agreed. They moved through the back of the cabin and into the wood, walking until they reached the second vehicle he had hidden long ago. "You ride up front," he said. She did. They drove for a long time. Silence, but not empty. Her hand brushed his. Neither moved away. They reached a reinforced shelter hidden in stone and earth. Inside, it was quiet. He checked her neck. She let him. She lay down. He sat nearby. Later she made space beside her. He joined her slowly. Her head rested against his shoulder. He adjusted so she could be comfortable. "Is this okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Outside, the world shifted. Inside, she learned something new. She could exist without disappearing. She could feel without breaking. She could be close without being owned. If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.